At 2:07 a.m., the phone rang, the way phones only ring when someone's about to change your life or ruin your sleep. The screen lit up my bedroom like a guilty conscience, and for half a second, I thought it was a spam call, one of those "we've been trying to reach you about your car warranty." Ghosts that never die. But then I saw the name .dad, not Dad's old number. Not unknown. It's just Dad, glowing on the screen like it never learned to move on. Here's the thing. My father had been gone for 3 years. A real gone. Funeral gone. Ashes in a box gone. The kind of gone that teaches you to stop setting extra plates at holidays because grief loves to embarrass you in front of mashed potatoes. So I stared at my phone the way you stare at a magic trick when you already know there's a trapdoor somewhere. My brain sprinted through the obvious explanations. A glitch? Someone playing a cruel joke? A hacked contact? A dream? I even checked the clock twice because if you're hallucinating, might as well fact check it. The ringing didn't stop. It wasn't frantic. It was steady, patient, like whoever was calling already knew. I'd pick up, my thumb moved before my courage did, and I didn't hear static. I didn't hear a stranger. I didn't hear some automated robot pretending to be my dead father. I heard him. The same voice that used to fill my childhood kitchen, half gravel, half warmth, telling me he was outside, telling me to open the door, telling me he was cold. The words landed in my stomach like a dropped glass. I didn't scream, didn't faint, didn't do any of the dramatic stuff you see in movies, because real fear is quieter than people think. Real fear makes you blink too much and forget how to swallow. I walked to the front door in socks I wasn't sure I'd put on. I unlatched the chain. I opened it, and what happened next is the reason I'm telling you this story now, because that night didn't just bring back my father, it brought back the part of me I'd buried with him. But to understand why that door felt like the edge of a cliff, you have to know who I was before the call, and who Dad was before he died. So let's rewind. Way back before the silence. Before the guilt. Before the night my phone lit up like a second chance. Welcome, story lovers. From where are you watching? Drop your city name in the comments so we can see how far our story travels. I grew up in a house that always smelled faintly of motor oil and coffee. Not the fancy cafe kind, more like Dad poured it into a chipped mug and forgot to drink it because someone's check engine light was blinking again. My father, Frank Miller, wasn't a loud man, but he was a solid one. The kind of person whose love didn't show up as speeches. It showed up as your tires being replaced before winter, somehow, without you ever noticing. It showed up as lunch money mysteriously appearing in your backpack after you swore you didn't need it. It showed him sitting awake in a recliner at midnight, pretending to watch TV while really waiting to hear me come home safe. Dad was a mechanic by trade and a guardian by instinct. He could fix anything that squeaked, leaked, or threatened to fall apart, from broken spark plugs to broken people. Our neighborhood treated him like a quiet emergency room. If your car died on the side of the road, you would call Frank. If your marriage was dying in slow motion, you probably still called Frank, because somehow he'd listen without judgment while tightening a bolt. Money was never plentiful. We weren't poor in the dramatic Hollywood way. Still, we were always one surprise bill away from a family meeting at the kitchen table. Dad called those meetings budget reality shows, 'cause he had a dry sense of humor that only functioned when life got tense. Mom left when I was 12. No villain soundtrack, no screaming showdown. Just a suitcase and a note that said she needed to find herself. I remember staring at the handwriting and thinking, you couldn't see yourself while helping me with homework. But that kind of anger is like trying to squeeze water in your fist. The more you grip, it's the more you lose. Dad didn't badmouth her. Not once. He just added shifts. Learned to braid my hair by watching a YouTube video 3 times. Burned spaghetti, laughed at himself, and tried again. If love had a shape, it would have looked like my father leaning over a sink, full of dishes at 1 a.m. because he didn't want me waking up to chaos. I was a decent student. The kind of student teachers like because you don't cause trouble. But in truth, I was quietly angry. Angry at Mom for leaving. Angry at Dad for not being able to stop her. Enraged at the world for acting like families are supposed to come with warranties. By high school, I was living in a permanent tug-of-war between wanting freedom and wanting to protect Dad from the weight he carried. I took a part-time job at a grocery store, not because we were starving, but because I couldn't stand the look on Dad's face when bills stacked up. I told him it was for experience. He knew the truth, but let me keep my dignity. The sacrifices weren't loud. They were tiny, constant, and exhausting. Dad wore the same winter coat for 11 years because it still works. He drove old pickups long past their glory days. Not because he liked nostalgia, but because he liked my college fund more. Speaking of college, I got in. A state school 2 hours away. Nothing fancy, but for us it felt like being invited to the moon. Dad cried the day I left. Not the kind of crying where you fall apart. The kind where you pretended your eyes were just allergic to pride. He hugged me too long, then stood in the driveway until my taillights disappeared. That was the first time I realized something. Sometimes the people who love you most are the ones you hurt without meaning to. I was so eager to become a real adult that I didn't see the loneliness I was leaving behind. College was busy, messy, and intoxicating. I made friends fast. I worked hard. I dated someone named Tyler who wrote poems about himself and called it vulnerability. I didn't know the difference yet. Dad called every Sunday. Always at 6 p.m., his voice was steady, but I could hear the quiet in his apartment in the background. The new silence where Mom's laughter used to be, where my chaos used to be. I visited on holiday. Each time I came home, Dad looked a little older in small ways that made me feel guilty for not noticing sooner gray threading through his hair. A longer pause before standing up. A cough he waved off like it was a bad joke. After graduation, I got a job in the city. I told myself it was temporary just to get on my feet. The truth was, I didn't want to feel poor anymore. I wanted a life where I didn't have to count groceries. I wanted to be the kind of adult who buys new coats before the old ones turn to rags. Dad was proud. Genuinely proud, but there was a flicker of fear in him I didn't understand at the time. Like he knew something about life I hadn't learned yet. I called him less. Not because I didn't love him, but because I was busy proving I'd escaped the version of myself that needed him. I loved him in the way grown kids often do, quietly, carelessly, assuming time was a renewable resource. Then the call came that I didn't answer. It was a Thursday. I was stuck in a late meeting, my phone buzzing in my bag. I saw Dad on the screen and figured I'd call back after. I even thought, he'll understand. But life doesn't care what you intend. By the time I stepped outside an hour later, I had 3 missed calls and a voicemail from a neighbor. Dad had collapsed in the garage. Heart attack. The kind that doesn't give you a warning. The kind that turns ordinary Thursdays into permanent scars. I drove like a maniac. I prayed to a God I wasn't even sure I believed in. I begged time to reverse itself like a rewound tape. I got there too late. The hospital room was full of fluorescent light and a stillness that felt wrong. Dad's body was there, but the him part, his voice, his warmth, his stubborn refusal to buy a new coat was already gone 3 years ago. I watched nurses pull a sheet over the man who had pulled my whole life together with his hands. At the funeral, I was the one holding it together for everyone else. But inside, I felt like I'd been hollowed out. I didn't just lose my father. I lost my anchor, my witness, the only person who knew exactly how far we'd come. Grief makes you weird. It made me angry at strangers for laughing. It made me flinch at the smell of motor oil. It made my Sundays feel like empty hallways. But guilt was worse. Because grief says they're gone. Guilt says you could have stopped it. I replayed that missed call so many times it felt like a looping curse. Every time my phone rang afterward, my chest tightened. Like my body was bracing for punishment. I tried to move on in the approved, functional ways. I went to work. I paid rent. I smiled in pictures. I told people I was doing okay because that's what adults say when they're drowning politely. I avoided the garage, avoided Dad's tools, avoided the last sweater he wore, still hanging in a closet like it was waiting for his shoulders, and I avoided thinking about the one thing I never said to him. I was sorry. 3 years is long enough for the world to expect you to be healed, but not long enough for your heart to believe it. I thought I'd carry that guilt forever. Then came the 2 a.m. call. After I opened the door that night, the cold hit me first. It was early November, the kind of damp, blunt cold that crawls through your bones and makes everything smell like wet leaves. The porch light washed the steps in yellow. The street was empty. No car, no figure. No shadow moving across the yard. Just a wind chime tinkling, as if it didn't know this was a profound moment. My brain couldn't accept what my eyes were seeing, so it tried to negotiate. Maybe he's nearby. Perhaps I'm hallucinating. Possibly I'm sleepwalking. Maybe this is grief finally short-circuiting my sanity. Then a shape shifted at the edge of the porch. Not a whole body. Not some movie-style apparition. A person standing half inside the darkness, like it belonged to him. Not young. Not glowing. Not perfect. Just familiar. A posture I'd known my whole life. The slope of the shoulders that carried the weight quietly. The way he leaned a little to the right, like the old knee injury that never fully healed. My heart didn't leap. It stopped. My whole body felt like it forgot its job. He looked up, and in that instant, my mind split in two. One half screamed, "Dad." The other half screamed, "No, no, no," because he looked like my father. But not like the last time I saw him. He looked tired, like someone who'd been working, somewhere long and hard and without sleep. His hair was grayer, his face thinner. His hands were raw in that way. Mechanic hands get raw-roughened by life. I didn't run to him. I didn't slam the door. I just froze, stuck between grief and disbelief. Between love and terror. He stepped forward, slow, cautious, almost like he was afraid I'd vanish if he moved too quickly. I could see his breath in the air. I remember thinking something silly and human. He really is cold. My throat tried to make words, but couldn't find any. I must have made some sound, something like a broken inhale, because his face softened. That softening was what broke me the most. It was the exact look Dad used to give me when I was a kid, and I'd scraped my knee. That wordless promise that you're safe now. I backed up into the hallway without even realizing it, leaving the door open like an idiot in a horror movie. He came inside. That air changed. You know how a room feels different when someone you love walks into it? Like the furniture learns how to breathe. It was like that, except layered with shock so thick I could barely see through it. He didn't say much. Not in long sentences. He didn't need to. The moment itself was already louder than language. My first coherent thought was, this can't be real. My second was, if it is real, I don't deserve it. I watched him sit on my couch like he'd done 1,000 times before. He rubbed his hands together. I noticed how he glanced around my place, taking in the little adult life I'd built, my stacked books, my cheap art, the throw blanket that still had a tag on it because I'd never bothered removing it. There were a million questions in me. None of them came out. I went to the kitchen on autopilot and put water on to boil. 'Cause apparently when your dead father returns, your brain still defaults to hospitality. I wasn't even thinking about what I was doing. I just needed motion so I wouldn't collapse while the kettle heated. I stared at my own shaking hands and tried to shove reality into place. If this wasn't a hallucination, then what was it? Had Dad faked his death? No. There were doctors, papers, an urn, a grave that was impossible. Was I dreaming? I pinched my arm hard enough to leave a mark. Pain shot up. Still not waking. Was this something cruel, someone who looked like him? Some scam, some trick? But he knew things. Tiny things. The way he reached for the mug with the chipped edge without looking. The way he stared for a second at the family photo on my shelf and smiled with that specific mix of pride and sadness. The way he coughed into his fist like he always did. Embarrassed by it, I walked back into the living room holding 2 mugs. Not trusting my voice to explain why I'd made tea at 2 a.m., he looked up at me and, with no drama, patted the couch beside him. I sat down because my legs were done for the night. He looked at me for a long time, not in a creepy way, in a way that felt like he was memorizing me again. Something about that stare melted my fear into grief. Hot, immediate, unstoppable. I cried. Ugly cried. The kind with hiccups and snot. The kind you don't do in romantic comedies. He let me cry without interrupting. That was always Dad's skill. He could sit beside your storm without trying to control it. When I finally started to breathe normally, I realized he was crying too. Silent tears. Sorry tears. Not because he was weak, but because he was human. And that's when the conflict really began, not in the room, but inside me, because being faced with the impossible isn't just scary. It's revealing. It forces all the stuff you've been training yourself to ignore to come out in one breath. Seeing Dad again wasn't just a miracle, it was a mirror. A mirror showing me how many calls I'd ignored when he was alive. How much guilt I'd wrapped around myself afterward. How I'd built an adult life that was sturdy on the outside but hollow on the inside. How I'd been surviving, not living. I wanted to throw my arms around him and beg him to stay forever. I also wanted to scream, "Where have you been? Why now?" But there was a heaviness in him, like he wasn't here on a casual visit. Like time was borrowing him. He finally told me, in that quiet dad way, that things weren't simple. That he hadn't come back for himself. He'd come back because something was unfinished, and I knew, without him spelling it out, that the unfinished thing was me. Because the truth is, I've been living in a half-life for 3 years. Doing the motions, avoiding the pain. Letting guilt be my punishment instead of my teacher. Dad's return. Whatever it really was, cracked the shell. I'd been hiding inside. But the deeper twist came next, not in a lightning bolt or a jump scare. In a piece of ordinary paper, he reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Softened and creased, as if it had been carried a long way. He put it on the coffee table between us. My name was written on it, in his handwriting. The handwriting I'd thought I'd never see again. I stared at it as if it were a bomb. He watched me, tired but steady. I opened it. Inside was a letter dated the day before he died, and it wasn't a goodbye. It was a confession. He wrote that he'd been feeling chest pain for weeks. That he hadn't told me because he didn't want to scare me or pull me back from my new life. He wrote that he was proud of me, proud in capital letters, in dad language, but that he was also scared I was losing myself in chasing safety. He wrote that he'd called me that Thursday because he finally decided to go to the doctor and wanted me to know. Wanted to hear my voice. He wrote that if anything ever happened to him, he didn't want me living in regret. He wanted me living wide upon because that's the only way love makes sense. By the time I finished reading, my chest was so tight I thought I might join him on the other side. He'd known, he'd felt it coming, and still he'd protected me. From it, I looked up at him, wrecked, and he looked back like someone who'd crossed an ocean to hand me a lifeboat. That letter didn't just explain his death. It exposed my last 3 years. I hadn't been honoring him. I'd been punishing myself. I hadn't been grieving in love. I'd been suffering in shame. And now I was sitting beside my dead father at 2 a.m., holding proof that he never wanted that for me. You'd think that would be relief. But relief can hurt too because it demands change. And change is terrifying when you've been hiding in pain for so long that pain feels like home, Dad. Being here forced a reckoning. Either the first stayed frozen in guilt, or I did the thing he came back to make sure I did. I faced my life for climax, breaking point. The night becomes a reckoning. I finally break and stand up. The hardest part of grief isn't the sadness. It's the way your brain turns everything into a courtroom. And you're both the defendant and the judge. For years, I'd kept myself on trial, replaying that missed call like evidence. Every good thing that happened to me afterward got filtered through a quiet whisper. You don't deserve this. You didn't pick up that night, with Dad sitting on my couch like a living memory. The trial finally reached its verdict. He didn't lecture. He didn't scold. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to crack the dam. I started talking, not neat or organized, just spilling. About the phone call I missed. About how I'd imagined his last moments 1,000 times. About how I'd hated myself for moving to the city, for not coming home more. For being too busy proving I was independent to remember that independence doesn't cancel love. I admitted how I'd been living small ever since. Working a job I didn't even like because it felt safer than risking something meaningful. Avoiding relationships because loss had made me suspicious of joy. Saying I'm fine so often, I almost believed it. The more I spoke, the more I realized I wasn't just talking to Dad. I was finally talking to myself. Dad listened. Exactly the way he used to when I was a kid, confessing I'd failed a test or broken a plate. He listened, like my truth wasn't a burden but a bridge. Then he did something that felt like a pin, dropped in a silent room. He got up slowly, like his body remembered being alive and wasn't thrilled about it. He walked to my bookshelf and picked up a framed certificate I'd stuffed in. They're not even displayed my old college. Award for the writing competition I'd won senior year. The one I'd stopped thinking about because real adults don't chase creative dreams. The one Dad had driven 2 hours to see me receive, clapping louder than anyone. He held it for a second, looked at me, looked at it, and he set it on the coffee table beside the letter. No. Big gesture, just placement, like these two things belong together. My chest went hot because I understood. I'd loved writing once. Not as a hobby, as a pulse, as a way of translating life into something that didn't scare me so much. Dad had always been the first person to tell me I was good at it. He used to say stories were how people survive the parts they can't fix. After he died, I stopped writing entirely. I didn't even notice it at first. It just slipped out of my life the way laughter can slip out after trauma. I told myself I was too busy, too tired, to grown up. But the real reason was uglier. Writing felt like living, and living felt like betraying him. That was the breaking point. Sitting in that room, staring at my award beside his final letter. It hit me that I'd twisted love into a prison. The guilt fell off me in one heavy, horrifying piece. Not because it vanished, but because I finally saw it for what it was, me trying to pay a debt he never charged me. I broke fully. The last polite layer peeled away. I cried so hard I tasted salt and regret and 3 years of holding my sposs. I said my breath, and somewhere in that mess, a new feeling cracked through the rubble. Anger, not at Dad, at myself for wasting the gift he'd spent his whole life giving me. The right to thrive. The night outside was still dark. The porch light still cast that soft glow through the blinds. The world hadn't changed, but inside me, something did. I didn't want to keep living as a monument to a mistake. I wanted to live as a continuation of his love. I looked at him through tear-blurred eyes and finally said the thing I'd been choking on for years, not in perfect words, not in a movie speech, just in raw truth. I was sorry, not sorry for missing the call in a neat, self-forgiving way. Sorry in a way that acknowledged I'd been a flawed human doing her best, but still capable of hurting people she loved. Dad reached out and took my hand. The pressure was real warm, calloused, and that touch was a forgiveness so complete. It stunned me. You don't realize how heavy self-hatred is until someone helps you put it down. The intensity of that moment didn't feel like a ghost story. It felt like a rescue. But rescue comes with a cost. You have to get up afterward. And Dad was here to make sure I did, because just as the night started to soften, just as the tears slowed, he looked exhausted in a way that scared me. Not sick. Exactly. More like someone whose time was thinning out. He leaned back on the couch and closed his eyes for a second. I panicked, asking if he was okay, asking if he was leaving, asking 100 questions in a voice that sounded 13. Again, he opened his eyes and gave me a tired smile. And that was When he showed me the final thing he'd come for, he pointed toward the hallway closet. The one I hadn't opened since the funeral? The one with his last sweater inside. The one holding his toolbox. I'd brought to my apartment because I couldn't bear to leave it behind. My throat tightened. I didn't want to go there. That closet was my grief museum. My not yet, but the night wasn't allowing not yet. I stood, legs shaking, and opened it. The smell hit me first. Dust, old cotton, faint oil. The scent of the man who raised me. On the shelf sat the red toolbox with his initials scratched into the top. Under a tall, smaller box I'd never noticed. Not hidden, just waiting. Dad nodded for me to take it. I did. Inside were notebooks. Dozens of them, worn and greasy at the corners. I opened the top one. They weren't repair logs. They were stories. Pages full of Dad's handwriting. Little moments he'd written down over the years. Things I'd said as a kid. Funny things customers did in the garage. Memories of Mom leaving. Notes about my college milestones. Thoughts about life, fear, pride, and love. My father had been writing in secret, not to publish. Not for anyone else, for me. I sat down on the floor and read random lines. Heart splitting open all over again. Dad hadn't just fixed engines. He'd been documenting the life we shared. As if he were afraid I'd forget how loved I was. I looked up at him. Stunned. He met my eyes, and in that quiet, powerful way he always had, gave me the last push. Not a demand. An invitation to take these stories and continue them. To stop shrinking. To stop apologizing for surviving. To build something that honored what we'd had without chaining myself to what I'd lost. That was the climax. Not the phone call, not the door. This, my father, returned to hand me myself back in the form of his hidden notebooks. And I knew right there on the floor that I was done living half live. Whatever this night was, whatever rule of the universe it had broken to happen, it was doing one thing crystal clear. It was giving me a chance to redeem the years I'd wasted in guilt. And I wasn't going to blow it. Dear audience, if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to give it a like. It really helps. The morning came the way mornings always do, unbothered by miracles. Sliding sunlight under blinds like nothing unusual happened at all. But I wasn't the same person who'd gone to bed. Dad was gone when I woke up, not vanished in smoke. Not dramatic. Just not there. The couch was empty. The mugs were in the sink. The letter and my old award were still on the table, where he'd placed them. The notebooks were still in my lap. I sat there for a long time, waiting for my brain to decide if the night had been real or a grief-shaped stream. But it didn't matter, because the impact was real. The guilt I'd been dragging around didn't feel like a virtue anymore. It felt like a betrayal of everything Dad stood for. So I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I called in sick, not because I was sick, but because I was finally listening to my body's truth. I spent that day reading Dad's notebooks, one by one. Like I was walking through the version of my life he'd been carrying lovingly in his chest. Some entries were funny. Dad had a gift for noticing the absurd details people miss. Some entries were heartbreaking. His fear for me. His loneliness. His quiet pride. The way he missed Mom but still never wanted me to feel abandoned because of it. And some were just ordinary notes about changing the oil. Then a line about how I used to dance in the driveway to make him laugh. Ordinary doesn't mean small. It means life by sunset. I had a strange calm in me, like a compass had finally remembered north. I found the courage to do the thing I'd been avoiding. I went home to the garage for the first time since his death. It was dusty, quiet, and painfully familiar. The old radio still sat on the shelf. Tools hung where his hands had left them. Grease stains marked the floor like footprints left by someone who'd mattered. I didn't collapse. I didn't run away. I cleaned. Not out of erasure, but out of love. I opened the windows, wiped down benches, put his tools in order, and while I was there, I did another thing that surprised me. I set up a small desk in the corner of the garage. the same corner where he used to drink coffee and scribble in his notebook between jobs. I brought a chair, a lamp, a fresh notebook. Then I sat down to write. At first, it was clumsy, like trying to speak a language you haven't used in years. But then words started coming. Not polished, not pretty. Just honest. I wrote about the missed call, the guilt, the years of sleepwalking. I wrote about Dad's hidden stories. I wrote about that night without trying to explain it, without trying to make it fit logic. I just wrote, and something happened in me I hadn't felt since he died. I breathed. That week became 2 weeks. 2 weeks became a habit. I started waking early before work to write. I started sharing little pieces online, nothing huge, just reflective posts about grief, love, and the ways people carry each other. People responded, quietly at first, then loudly. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who felt haunted by the things they didn't say. One message from a stranger stuck to my ribs. She said she'd lost her mother a year ago and had been drowning in regret. She said my words felt like a hand on her back. That's when I understood what Dad had been doing all those years with his notebooks. He wasn't just leaving me memories, he was leaving me purpose. So I made a leap that scared me more than any ghost ever. I left my job, not in a dramatic storm out of the office way, in a careful adult way, with 2 weeks' notice and polite emails. But inside, it felt like jumping off a cliff with only faith for a parachute. I used my savings to take a part-time gig and give myself room to write seriously. I started shaping Dad's stories into something bigger, a collection, a memoir, a channel, a home for other people's grief and hope. It wasn't an immediate success. Life doesn't do instant montages. There were months I doubted myself, months I ate cheap noodles again, months I wondered if I'd mistaken a miracle for a midlife crisis. But every time the fear got loud, I opened Dad's notebooks and remembered his handwriting. I remembered what he wrote near the back of one journal. He hoped that if I ever found these, I'd stop being afraid of my own light. So I kept going. A year later, I published a book. Not a bestseller overnight, not a glamorous debut, but a real, tangible thing with Dad's stories braided through mine. People bought it, talked about it, passed it around. Book clubs invited me. Podcasts asked me to share the story. I gave talks at community centers about grief and resilience, speaking to a room full of strangers who somehow felt like family. And in every place I went, I carried Dad with me, not as a wound, but as a partner. The most unexpected redemption wasn't the career shift. It was the way my relationship with his death changed. I visited his grave without feeling like I was being punished. I brought coffee and talked out loud. I laughed sometimes, which used to feel illegal. I forgave myself. Not because I forgot the missed call, but because I finally believed what Dad had tried to tell me. Even before he died, love doesn't demand perfection, it demands presence. And it can be present now. I also reconnected with parts of my family I'd drifted from. I called my aunt more. I checked on the old neighbors. I learned to accept love without apologizing for it. A few years after the night of the call, I started a small foundation in Dad's name, not huge. No fancy politics, just a local fund to help single parents in our county with vocational training and emergency bills. The stuff that used to corner Dad at our kitchen table. At the first fundraiser, I stood in the community hall where he'd once fixed everyone's cars for free. And I looked around at people who still spoke his name as if it were a blessing. A man came up to me, tears in his eyes, and told me Dad had once repaired his truck at midnight so he could get to his kid's surgery the next morning. A woman said Dad had slipped her grocery money when she was too proud to ask for it. Another person said Dad's quiet kindness had kept her from giving up. I'd spent years thinking my father's legacy ended in a garage. It disdains single quotes. It was everywhere. And now, so is mine. Not because I'd become famous or rich, but because I'd stopped hiding. I'd taken the love he gave me and let it turn into something living. Some days I still miss him so sharply it feels like a bruise. Grief doesn't disappear. It just changes clothes. But now when I feel it, I don't crumble into guilt. I write. I help people. I live. That's redemption. That's what Dad came back to hand me. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories every week. Some people will hear this story and look for the logical explanation. They'll want the neat headline, "Woman hallucinated after grief." Phone system glitch. Unresolved trauma manifested as a dream. And maybe that's true. Maybe it was my mind stitching itself back together in the only language it knew, my father's voice. Maybe the universe bent for a night. Maybe love, when it's strong enough, can echo past the walls we think are permanent. The honest answer is, I don't know, but I know what matters. Dad's death was real. My guilt was real. And the life I reclaimed afterward was real. Sometimes the miracle isn't whether something supernatural happened. Sometimes the miracle is what it changes in you. For 3 years, I treated regret like a religion. I worshipped my mistake, thinking suffering was the only way to stay loyal to him. But loyalty isn't a cage. It's a continuation. Love doesn't want you to shrink. It wants you to expand until you look like the faith someone had in you. So if you're carrying your own version of the mist, call some moment you replay at night, some regret that keeps you small. Let me ask you something gently. What would the person you loved most want for you right now? Would they want you stuck, apologizing to the air? Or would they want you living so fully that their love keeps moving through you? Here's the twist I didn't tell you until now. Last spring, I was invited to speak at a high school career day in my hometown. Afterward, a quiet kid waited until everyone left. He had grease under his nails and a nervous grin. He told me he worked part-time at a shop. He said he'd found my book on his mom's nightstand after she died. He read it because he missed her and didn't know what to do with the ache. Then he said something that made my knees go soft. He said my father used to let him hang around the garage after school, let him sweep floors, learn to use tools, and stay out of trouble. He said Dad would talk to him about cars and life, and always ended with the same line, that everyone gets one life, and it's too precious to spend it punishing yourself. The kid said he'd been repeating that to himself every day since his mom died. I walked out to my car afterward and cried in the parking lot, not in pain, but in awe, because Dad didn't just come back to save me. He'd been saving people long before that night. And now, through the stories he left me, he was still doing it. So maybe the question isn't whether the dead can call us. Maybe the real question is, when love calls you back to life, will you open the door? Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories and new videos.